In today's video, we are going to cover the basics of coil building. We are going to make a simple 6-inch sphere. In order to do this, you'll need a compass, a ruler, a small piece of cardboard, and a pair of scissors. This will get us through the initial setup. So, a little bit of high school math here again. If you want to make a 6-inch sphere, what we'll need to do is create a 3-inch radius. So I'm going to measure with my compass to 3 inches. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and draw 2 circles using this measurement on my wear board. And I'm just going to recheck my measurement here. Still at 3 inches, so I'm all set. And next, I'm going to measure from the one corner of the piece of cardboard and draw a quarter arc. I'll just go over these lines with a dry erase marker here so you can see them a little bit better. Then what you're going to do is cut out this quarter circle, and this piece of cardboard will become your template. This can be discarded, we don't need that. We're just going to use this half so that as we're building up coiled layers, we can match both the diameter of the circle. We're going to make 2 hemispheres, so we'll have a 6-inch diameter at the middle, and then we will have the right curve as we move up to the top of the hemisphere. Okay, so that's the basic setup. We are next going to roll some coils and start putting these together. So I'm starting out with a handful of clay. I typically do not wedge when I'm making coils. I'll simply start out by squeezing the clay into a rough coil. My clay feels pretty wet. Here you can see a little air pocket that popped as I was doing this. This is why I don't worry too much about wedging for coils. Usually you can get those air pockets out while you're prepping the coil. So this is a very crude coil that I have ready. I could use this one if I were making a large thing, but typically you're going to want to roll these a little bit smaller. I'm working on a canvas covered table today. This is a good surface for rolling coils. It will pull some of the moisture out of the clay, which in this case is an okay thing because the clay I'm working with, as I mentioned, is pretty wet. If you were working with clay that were a little drier, what you would want to do is just spritz the table. I'll do it down here where I'm not going to be working. And you're not looking to create a puddle, you're just trying to add some moisture to the canvas so that it doesn't pull moisture out of the clay. When you're rolling coils, you want to do 1 full revolution before rolling back the other direction. The other thing to keep in mind is you're going to be rolling and spreading your hands out as you go, and it's this spreading that's going to make the coil become thinner and longer. So I go back to the middle, start again. As you're doing this, you'll find that you can become very nuanced with how you're applying pressure to the coil. For example, if you have a thin area like I have here, when I roll, I'll skip that area with the pressure as I go over it. Alternatively, if you want to make that area thicker, you can bring your hands together on either side of it, and that area of the coil will thicken up. So you can see from that handful of clay, I wound up with a very, very long coil. This one's still fairly thick as well, but this is an okay thickness for what I'm going to do with these coils, and I'll show you why. So I'll wind up cutting this in half, but what I'd like to do first is just kind of see how long it needs to be. So it looks like I can cut it. I'm going to cut it a little bit long, and then I'll save this coil for the next layer. So as I'm working here, what I'd like to do is push my coil down onto the board so that it's inside that circle that I drew. I'll smush the end of the bottom coil down and then lay the coil on top of that area and just smush away the excess. Since this clay is very wet, as long as I just consolidate those ends together, I'll be okay. I won't need to add slip right now. And then my next coil is just going to go straight on top of here. So go ahead and cut that one and save this piece for my next section. Now, when you're coil building, if you lay the coil directly on top of the one beneath it, you will create vertical height. If you lay that coil slightly outside of the coil beneath it, you can see now this coil is no longer long enough to make its way around, and my shape starts to go out. So if you're creating a bowl, this is ideal. To create a hemisphere, what we actually want to do is lay that coil slightly inside of the one beneath it. And then we can use our template to make sure that we are matching our curve. Now the trick to using this is to lay this flat edge directly onto the board and then put this corner right up against your mark on your wear board. And then you want this to be right in the middle of the piece. Ideally, you want this each coil that you're adding to not quite touch the board. So I'm well away from it, which is good because when I consolidate these two coils together, what will wind up happening is the hemisphere will wind up growing wider. Just like with pinch pots, as you pinch a piece of clay, the clay is thinner but has to take up a larger surface area and will expand. It's much easier to get this to grow out than to get it to go in. So I'll go ahead and retrim this at its new spot. And then just for the sake of teaching you the safest possible way to attach these items, we're going to use slip on every single one of these joints. I'd like you to consider testing that limit and see if you can get away with making coiled objects without doing this scoring and slipping. It is possible to do it. You have to be really familiar with the moisture level in your clay and sort of know when you can get away with it and when you can't. If you have doubts or concerns, if you score and slip every time, you'll never have problems. The other thing you want to pay attention to is my first seam was right here, so I'm not going to place the second one directly above that. I'll just move slightly over. Now, as I'm pushing this coil on, I'm pinching the side and gently pushing that coil onto the coil beneath it, taking care that my bottom coil does not wind up going outside of the circle that I created. I am going to consolidate these coils a little more aggressively, but for now, I'm just going to keep building and gaining height. Creating a coiled sphere is a really good activity to make coil anything, really, because if you can create a sphere, you can do a lot of other shapes. So I'm using my last section of clay here. Finding a new location for my start and end. And this time, I'm going to have to even be more aggressive with that angle that I'm taking. Good. And then I'll go ahead and pinch this coil down as well. My curve is still well within my template, which is good. These coils are still fairly thick, and so as I start to thin those out, you'll see that the object will grow wider. So I don't have enough coil left in order to finish this one, so I'll just grab a small amount of clay and roll another coil to finish this object up. Okay, you can kind of see I'm creating a little bit more of a cone shape here than a hemisphere. So this top part is too tall, and I'm seeing that because when I put this down, I can't quite get this bottom edge to meet the board. If I do, it starts to push down on the top of my coil here, which is okay. So what I want to do is close this up. There's a couple of ways you can do it. The way that I used to do it was just to kind of make the little spiral here at the top with your coils. What winds up happening a lot of the time with this ending is you will get a crack where these coils meet because it's hard to compress them in a way that is strong enough for the clay. So what I like to do instead at this point is cut that section off and then just create a small pinch pot that can fit onto that top area. And then I just have one seam at the edge rather than a seam that spirals into the middle. In order to get this to come down a little bit though, I'm going to have to push my coils together. So I'm squeezing the clay between my thumb and fingers and pushing my fingers together then. If you simply push it down in one area, then it will rise up in other areas. And you'll wind up just sort of chasing your own tail around the piece. Like when we were trying to make pinch pots smaller at their opening, you'll get these puckered edges, which is totally fine, especially when the clay is so wet, because you can just smooth those out. Before I close this up though, while I still have access to the interior, I'm going to use a serrated rib in this case, although since you maybe don't have one of these at home, I'll try one of these smooth ribs. And I'm going to pull the clay up first, so I'm supporting it from the interior with my left hand, and I'm pulling the rib up along that exterior surface. These metal ribs are nice for this consolidation because I can bend it as I'm pulling, so I can do a complex curve. I'm curving in this direction and also working my rib on a curve. In doing that, my opening just about closed here. So probably cut that a little bit bigger actually, so that I have an easier time closing it up. So I'm going to cut it on an angle, holding the knife out at a flange, kind of like I'm cutting a pumpkin top, so that I have a little bit more surface area to work with here as an attachment point. Additionally, before I close it up, what I'm doing right now is pulling my finger up along the interior of this, consolidating all those coils. If you find it hard to reach in at this point, or perhaps your fingers aren't long enough, you can do this as you're going as well with each coil. Okay, so I'm noticing with my template I still have I need a little bit more swell in the piece, and so that's easy. I can just pull my finger up along that interior curve, pushing out as I go, and it's going to add a little bit of swell to that piece. Again, it's way easier to make the curve bigger than it is to make it collapse or get smaller. Okay, so I have a little bit of a gap here, and then up here it's tight. And so if I go around and squeeze my hands to the center, that will make that hole get a little bit smaller, which is making this curve become tighter as well. Yep, and you just want to work your way around, check your template around the object in multiple spots, just so you're sure that you've got a fairly cohesive curve, and this will lead you to creating more of a ball shape at the end rather than an oval. So with that small opening that's left, I can just take really a tiny amount of clay and make I'm making a pinch pot that's roughly the same thickness as the walls of the hemisphere. You can see that I've made it too big. Okay, so that'll be a good patch. Just score that one up. Now I no longer have access to the interior, so I'm starting from that little pinch pot and working the clay out. However, once it's closed, you have the advantage that there's trapped air inside, and so you can use that almost as a second hand on the interior as you try to get this shaped more in the direction that you want it to be. It's really important to remember, though, that our goal here with the rib or whatever tool you happen to be using to consolidate your coils is not a smooth surface. The goal is to get those coils to really get smushed together as deep into the center of the wall as possible. So this is not a light touch activity. You're not just trying to smooth them away. You're trying to change the wall so that it becomes joined. If you don't do that, your seams will tend to reopen when you, as the object is drying. So that's the first half. I'll do the second half a little bit faster here, and then we'll wait and join these together when they're a little bit drier and that curve is supporting itself.
At this point, I'm going to risk something here, and I'm going to loosen this up by wiggling it back and forth gently. And I can get it to release from the board. And then I really want to spend some time getting that last seam really well consolidated. You can see all the rest of my coils are pretty well hidden from the interior. You can also see the wall thickness of this is rather thick. And we'll wind up changing that a little bit more after the pieces are put together. You could make your coils thinner, but you may have to go a little bit slower than I did in order to allow them to stiffen to bear the weight between layers. I'm going to set this back down gently directly on the wood so that it dries, but I don't want to leave it too long, otherwise the bottom edge of the hemisphere may become too dry, and then I'll have a hard time putting the two of these together. Now that it's flipped back over, I'm just going to go over all those curves again with the metal rib, because I want to smooth out any irregularities in the shape that I created by flipping it while it was still wet.
Okay, so you're going to want to let this sit for a few hours. How many hours depends on how you wrap it. If you leave it in the open air, it probably will be ready within a couple of hours here in Wisconsin spring. If you are in a different climate, your dry times are going to vary. The other thing you can do is just cover it loosely with a piece of plastic, and that will help it from drying too fast. If you want to leave it overnight, I would strongly recommend the clay is on the board directly, but the plastic will get wrapped underneath. If you trap some air in there with the pieces, they'll dry a little bit more rather than if you pull the plastic tight to the tops of these. So I'm going to let these sit and dry for a while as I move on to the next project. It's been a few hours and my two hemispheres should be dry enough that I can attach them and they can support their own weight. Let's take a look and see what they feel like. So the clay is still fairly squishy. I'm able to dent it easily, but there is some stiffness to it as well on the exterior. And I think if I'm careful, I can go ahead and join these two halves. So let's give it a go. The very first thing you're going to need to do is roll out a coil of wet clay. And what we're going to do with this, it should be relatively thick, is we're going to fashion this into a small donut. And you don't have to worry about scoring and slipping these ends together. What this is going to do is support the bottom half of this ball and keep it from flattening as it would normally be sitting on the table. The width of this is important. If it's too narrow, there'll be too much stress on the interior here and it will flatten out anyway. If it's too wide, then the middle will touch the table, which you don't want either. Presumably, if you were just making a sphere, usually when I have students do this, I have them carve an image over the entire surface. And oftentimes they'll fire the sphere on this donut through both the bisque and the glaze firing so that it's not rolling around. Depending on what you choose to do with this shape, it may or may not need this through the firings. If it's stable, then it would not need it. So go ahead and set that there. It's wet enough. I'm going to grab a piece of newspaper to put between the two halves. If the hemispheres are a little bit stiffer or drier, they wouldn't need anything between them and that coil because it's hard enough to get two pieces of clay to stick together anyway, and they wouldn't just stick. Just a single sheet will do it, and in fact, just so it's not in my way, I'm going to cut this down. If the clay were stiffer, I would score this, add slip, and then score it again and add more slip just to rehydrate that seam. One thing I am going to do though is carve this top edge a little bit thinner so it's almost like it's rounded off. I'm carving the edges off here. So you can see it's beveled on this outer edge and the inner edge, making this slightly narrower. And then on the other side, what I'm going to do is carve a trough, and this will increase the strength of that seam. Alright, so as I'm joining these two halves together, I'm going to support the bottom with my hand lifting upwards, and my fingertips are going to push that top section down. Then, as we were doing when we were building with the coils, we want to really get this seam to be very, very well compressed. And there is enough clay there that I can, or enough slip coming out that I can reinforce that seam as well with a secondary coil. Okay, now that the two halves are joined together, I'm going to use a paddle. In this case, it's just a spatula to reinforce that seam, and I'm taking advantage of the air that's trapped inside to help it keep its shape. At this point, I'll let the sphere stiffen up a little bit more, let that seam homogenize, and I will want to poke an air hole in this just using a needle tool. There is air pressure that's trapped inside of here. If I don't release that, it will break apart at the seam most likely. But I'll just let this dry up, and you can do some carving to it. You could turn it into any number of shapes. If you can master the sphere, though, you can coil build just about anything you want. When you do poke a hole in this, listen carefully. You might hear the air escape.